right over there. Thank you very much, and welcome to our panel. We have 35 minutes here to talk about how we want to regulate distributed ledgers. Now, I have the honor to be in a group of distinguished friends and lawyers, the best specialists in the world. Actually, for the sake of time, we will not have a personal introduction, but I tell you, they are pretty bright brains. Now, here you see them on the screen, and the idea of the panel today is that we will talk about how we could or how we should regulate ledger technology. We want to see that from all different jurisdictional angles. We have different jurisdictions represented here, so my wish to you is if you start to talk, tell the audience from which jurisdiction you are. Now, we would talk about the present regulatory situation, about initiatives in the specific jurisdiction, as well as innovation in regulation. So let's say, I would like to hear from all the panelists, what would be the wish list of the best regulation for decentralized technology applications. We will focus on certain topics, on questions of what is a cryptocurrency, currency discussions. We will talk shortly about the ICOs, and we will talk about one of the very important issues and basis for the development of our ecosystem, which is the integration of our world into the existing regulated financial world, which is a little bit an obstacle at the moment. And at the end of the day, we will talk about, or at the end of the audience panel, we will talk about AML, anti-money laundering, potential risks, and possibilities to regulate and mitigate. Now, I would like to start with some provocation. What I recently heard, it's a statement of Augustine Carstens, the general manager, Bank of International Settlements. You can read it. It's like the novel technology is not the same as better technology or better economics. That is clearly the case with Bitcoin. While perhaps intended as an alternative payment system with no government involvement, it has become a combination of a bubble, a Ponzi scheme, and an environmental disaster. The volatility of Bitcoin renders it a poor means of payment and a crazy way to store value. Very few people use it for payments or as a unit of account. Now, Daniel, you are close to me. What do you think about such a statement?
Yes, it's interesting. I think there are some legit objections in there, but it is obviously a statement made by a representative of an institution which is quite likely to perceive DLT or blockchain technology as a competitor to their existing business case. And I think this is the most obvious comment I have to that one.
Now, Josh, cryptocurrency. What is for you cryptocurrency?
You mean how do I feel about it, or what do I think of it?
Mm-hmm.
When I think of it, typically I say, when people say cryptocurrencies, I'm like, wait a minute, it's digital tokens, right? They're all digital tokens. But as far as payment mechanisms, when I look at a quote like this, I start thinking about other areas of the world where currencies are devalued or they're completely unstable, where actually maybe Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies generally might be a good choice in terms of storing value and making transactions.
Okay, and Thomas, is it a Ponzi scheme?
I don't think. If we look at the volatility, everyone says there's too much volatility and there is no real value. Volatility is always kind of a measurement towards another value. So there is a Bitcoin, for me, there is no volatility in Bitcoin. One Bitcoin is one Bitcoin. It's only volatility towards Swiss francs or US dollars or other measurements. So certainly if you look in a specific ecosystem that runs on Swiss francs and you have balance sheets that runs on Swiss francs, yes, there is volatility. But if you're able to build up an ecosystem that runs on Bitcoin or any other token, and that token has a specific function as a settlement or a payment mechanism, there will be no volatility because the denomination If it's Bitcoin, it's one Bitcoin. If it's a Swiss franc backed token, it's one Swiss franc. So it's always the perspective how you look at something. And with regard to the Ponzi scheme, I just call it market. At the end, every market is a scheme that if a lot of people want something, the value goes up. If no one wants it, it's zero. So it's quite an easy system, you know.
So now, what do you think, Rachel, if an official is actually quoting such statements about a new technology?
I think, as the other panelists have noted, this is the first time in history that central banks haven't had the monopoly on what is money, right? So consumers will choose what they think is the most trusted system, and all around the world, not even just Venezuela or Zimbabwe, but the United States, other countries where the governments have been printing money furiously and seeing the currency devalue. It's sensible for people to go to Bitcoin or other cryptos where there is trust inherent in the technology. So I guess I see that as someone who probably doesn't understand the technology and doesn't understand that consumers can choose now what money is, right?
Nigel, in England.
Yes.
Now, I think the overall, let's say, public perception is getting mature and mature. At the beginning, blockchain and decentralized technologies were always Bitcoin. And they were always cryptocurrency or virtual currency. Now what we see is that it's much more than just a currency function. What is the present discussion in England regarding cryptocurrency?
Okay. I think we're in an interesting place in the UK at the moment. We've got the terrible B word, which I cannot mention on the stage. But I didn't see our flag at the EU blockchain initiative, which I'm sorry about. So in England at the moment, it's a little bit like the internet in 1998. There is a lot of ignorance. A lot of people are talking about it. I heard Bitcoin and blockchain described as like teenage sex. Everybody's talking about it, but not many people are doing it. but the reality is there's a huge interest in the UK, but there is also, I think there's a lot of ignorance and fear at the senior level within the banking industry. So it's a lot like 1998 in the internet, which I'm old enough to remember. And I remember people saying, this internet thing is never going to take on. Who's going to want this? And of course, this is nonsense. There is fantastic technology out there. I think it's when what we see in England, we're seeing a lot of new businesses, a lot of initiatives in this space, but we're still talking amongst the few of us who are big fans of the space, and what we need to do is to expand that and get it out to a wider audience so that more people start to adopt this fantastic technology.
Okay. Thank you very much, Nigel. So Ursula, will we Brexit the crypto space in Switzerland?
Why not? But I would add something. We also, till now, we had, but in closer communities, it's an old system. We had, for example, in Switzerland, Wir money. It's another type of fiat money, but it's a close community, and therefore people has confidence, and now it's open, it's anonymous, and it's worldwide, and I agree, because of the technology, people does not feel secure, and I think that's why some people quote in this way.
Okay, thank you very much. Now let's move to the next topic, a topic which is very decisive for the development of our crypto ecosystem. We have, the already regulated financial industry, the banks and the insurance, and we have the new upcoming technology. And what we face all over the world, just as one of the example, the problem that we cannot integrate our crypto world into the regulated world. Just to get a bank account for a crypto startup is a nightmare. Now here, it's another quote, what I recently heard, which goes a little bit in the same direction, made by the chair of the European Banking Authority, say, okay, recently several central banks have argued that the cryptocurrencies lack the institutional backup of a central bank and cannot fulfill the traditional functions of money. Unit of accounts, means of exchange, and reserve of value. The very large fluctuation in the valuations recently experienced by most of cryptocurrencies seem to confirm this view. Now, one of the options would be preventing regulated financial institutions from buying, holding, or selling these products, and possibly also from establish direct or indirect connections with managers of cryptocurrency so as to segregate the two sets of players. Now, question is, should the regulators really prevent regulated financial institutions, such as banks and insurance companies, from buying, holding, or selling cryptocurrencies? Daniel.
Short answer, definitely not. The thing is, I guess we cannot deny that due to the nascent technology and ecosystem that there are significant risks when investing and trading crypto assets. But there are no two crypto assets that are alike. We need to, and that somehow relates to what Thomas just mentioned, is that tokenization is just a means of digital securitization. And so what is decisive from a regulatory point of view is what underlying asset are we actually talking about? And we need to bear in mind that when it comes to ICOs, for instance, that most of those underlying assets are seed or very early stage companies. And everyone who's ever tried to put a reasonable price tag on a conventional startup or early stage company knows that this is an exercise which is somehow doomed to fail, and this is nothing else in crypto. So I think it's from that perspective, most regulated institutions are already engaged in some alternative asset classes that have a significant risk exposure, and so I think there is no reason per se to prevent those players from engaging in that market. Even to the extent we can make sure that those guys meet their internal compliance requirements.
Mm-hmm. George.
So I think it's a matter of how much investment and what types of companies, right? So obviously you wouldn't, I would at least think you wouldn't want a bank putting all of its assets, or a retirement fund putting all of its investments into crypto. I think it's a matter, as Daniel said, of seeing how much risk you typically might allocate for risky investments, how much money would typically be invested in that way, and then perhaps that may be a path forward. I know in the US, the director of the investment management division of the SEC, Dahlia Blass, had released some questions that were trying to get people who had, say, regulated funds or were interested in having regulated funds that would invest primarily in digital assets. A lot of questions were posed actually to the group, like how do you figure out custody? How do you, if you were going to have all of your investments or a large amount of your investments in these types of assets, how do you, if you ordinarily could only, have a certain amount invested in risky assets, how do you figure out valuation? How do you figure out, hedging against risk? I think there's so many questions.
Thank you. How is the situation, Rachel, in New Zealand?
Certainly in New Zealand, we've got a very light touch regulatory environment. So it's very technology neutral and principles based, which is really good for crypto. Of course, there's ambiguity. And as an advisor trying to help clients, have definitive advice, you have to sometimes take a view. But the regulators are becoming better at giving really clear guidance. So at the moment, for example, most cryptocurrencies would not be a security. There are a couple of aspects that you might need to give some further consideration to, but we do have, a lot of these cryptocurrencies, fair dealing or market conduct rules that would still apply, consumer protection laws. So I feel like at the moment the regulation is probably at a good level where it is, protecting investors in the space without being too heavy-handed.
Nigel, in England, do you have banks already offering the buying, holding, or selling of cryptocurrencies?
The short answer is no, we don't. It's becoming quite an issue. I have a lot of clients in the crypto space, and the problem they have is getting banked. And even we have in the UK, we have a really strong alternative finance scene, and we have a lot of new banks. And you go and speak to them, thinking these guys are going to be crypto friendly, they're going to be modern, and they say, "Oh no, we're very keen on fintech, but we can't take crypto."
Now, Thomas, the situation in Switzerland, I mean, we have banks actually accepting cryptos, not accepting, actually accepting that the clients hold a crypto account. What do you see will be the development here in Switzerland?
I mean, again, for banks, what's the main, or the main topic is the balance sheet risk. So if you have assets that are not dominated in the balance sheet currency like Swiss francs, you have some risks in the balance sheet. So you, as a bank, you need to understand what it is and what these risks are. And on the other hand, you also need to be able to communicate this to your investors and customers. So what we are seeing is that the banks try to qualify different type of tokens, classify them in specific classes in order then to be able also to map the risks that are also associated to this specific token with regard to counterparty, but predominantly also with regard to technology. So you need to be able to explain to the customers what are the protocol risks. There is a network involved, there are miners involved. How is there a risk that the network will break down totally or not and the assets are gone forever? Or do you have specific technology measures like cold storage, etc., that kind of prevents that? So I think it shifts from mere balance sheet risks more to technology risks that you need to be able to qualify.
Now, Ursula, let's say from a more like a policy perspective, should this new world be integrated into the existing regulation, or should there be two sets of different regulations, one for the crypto finance world and one for the, let's say, the old traditional finance world?
I think that's a keyword, tradition and new world. And when I see this quote, it's from a perspective of a national state with borders, and now we have no more borders. And how can you regulate for a national state and another national state for your banks and your people? I think it's impossible. We have really to find new ways and probably to improve people, banks, companies, probably to improve by giving them best practices, for example, and more work together on an international level. I think that's the only way we can deal with these new technologies.
Yeah, I mean, the governments, they have a monopoly generally,
yes,
with regard to currency. So it's actually their only tool to influence the economy. And they do this badly. I mean, they really influence everything, more or less. But that's the control they have. So they are certainly afraid to lose this control. But like we also see in the European Union with the euro, so you lose some local control, certainly. And the national banks, they certainly want to keep in a way this control.
I mean, I heard a very interesting speech of the head of development of the Bank of England, actually, and they have started a pilot project to issue a national bank-backed security token. So he made one introductory statement. He said, listen, you're not allowed to actually make photos of my presentation. Secondly, don't quote me. And thirdly, don't ask questions. But I tell you, frankly, that the project has, the result of the project, let's say the preliminary result of the project is that from a technology point of view, it would be absolutely feasible to issue such a token. However, what he said, from an economical point of view, all the models which they have actually played through were very difficult because they couldn't find a real result. What would happen if a national bank would issue a token which is directly on the balance sheet of the national bank? So he showed us in the audience formulas, and you get a headache if you see these formulas, how they calculate the potential risk. Now, what do you think? will we see in the future a Swiss franc token or a pound token? I mean, you're far away from a euro.
getting further away.
Or a US or an NZ dollar token or a euro token. What do you think, panel?
I don't see why you shouldn't. I think interestingly you mentioned the Bank of England because if you look for clues from the regulatory perspective in the UK, it's very hard to actually see very much. It's like being a medieval historian with very little source material. But if you go and speak to people informally, there's huge support for blockchain. There's actually a lot of interest and quite sort of, I wouldn't say support, but certainly a great deal of interest and enthusiasm for cryptocurrencies amongst quite a lot of people individually within the regulators, within both the Bank of England and the FCA. So I think absolutely things could change and technology can move on. You have one early adopter, then everybody else starts to follow suit. Again, it's like the internet in 1998.
You said there will be a crypto pound.
I think there will be one day. I don't know when.
Okay.
Look, I agree. I think there definitely will be. New Zealand's looking at this project. I know Canada, a lot of other countries around the world. Perhaps, looking at it from the other side, countries like China might be quite interested in programmable money where they can sort of track transactions. So there's I guess an upside and a downside to a central authority issuing these coins. But I think we'll probably see decentralized currencies and state-issued currencies, operating side by side.
Ursula?
Oh, I'm sure. I think this is a logic next step in the shift from the materialized world to the digital world, and we will get used, all of us, I'm sure.
I mean, a lot of these, let's say, blockchain-based applications, they run with currency. I mean, you can't feed them with fiat, so it's actually a need to build that, Germany.
Of course.
Yeah, and actually, it's just a way, a means of digital securitization, and in the end, it's and from a regulator's perspective, it's quite interesting because it's a completely new means of monitor and regulate transactions. When Alice is transferring some value in Swiss francs to Bob, for instance, and things like that, I think we're quite likely to see some fiat-backed tokens issued by, well, let's say central banks or certain states within the next 5 years.
Good. We already have something like a US dollar-backed token.
You're not talking about Tether, right?
John.
Yeah. Yes. So without talking about that, I also think that there's a place ultimately for central bank-backed tokens. I mean, I think in the US, as maybe the case in many other jurisdictions, but perhaps I'll just talk about the US for a second. I mean, we have sort of a challenge with terminology and classification right now. So if you have a digital token, it's really interesting. You could say, is it property? Is it a commodity? Is it a security? Is it money? I mean, depending on which regulator you ask in the US, it's all of the above, right? You've got the IRS saying it's intangible personal property, right? You have the CFTC saying it's a commodity. You have the SEC saying it's likely to be a security, although we did get some new guidance this week that was interesting. And you have FinCEN and others saying, it can be virtual currency. So I think for us, I think it will take some steps, obviously, and years to get to that point. But I do agree with what was said earlier about it is a really interesting thing if you end up in a situation where all of your currency someday might move to a digital token. And what does that mean for privacy implications in terms of tracking where the money moves?
I mean, Josh, you mentioned a very, very important issue which always crosses our path when we talk about cryptocurrencies and cryptos. We have to establish in the industry a protocol that we talk about the same thing when we talk about the security whatsoever. So it should be more like a functional definition approach. What we see in the industry, a lot of people talking about, this could be security, this could be a function token, this could be a utility token, whatsoever, but there is not really a common understanding. And we should have a more like a distant approach and have it more like a technology functionality description to see what we really have as a functionality, and then to start to think, okay, how we should regulate, or is it already regulated? I think we should, and that's a work we as a lawyer should do as well. We should actually establish a certain kind of also of language protocol regarding definitions. And I would like just now hand over to does it work? Yes, now it works. Now to you, Thomas, because we always hear about ICOs, ICO concerns worldwide, ICO as a bad thing. But my question is, does an ICO as such really exist? Do we have a one-type ICO to actually call them all ICOs, Thomas?
No. That's why I just look at it as a crowdfunding in a very general term. And the question is, what is the consideration that you get in return for providing money to a project? And there are different types of crowdfunding. So the traditional crowdfunding is an IPO where you get equity rights. However, there are also bonds that you issue, so that's then liabilities that are created. Or it can be a donation, or it can be a kind of a product or a service that you get in return. And the tokens or the ICO is to be qualified in the same way. So the question is, what do you get in return? Is it a usage of a functionality, or is it a share in a company where you also have revenue rights and other rights associated to it? And depending on in which category the token is qualified, it will be treated completely different from a regulatory but also tax point of view.
Thank you. Now, I see the time is running. We have some really interesting topics are still on the list. Now, very short for each jurisdiction. What is the situation of ICO situation in England?
Okay, so in the UK, we are seeing much more interest in ICOs than we were. Generally, there have been basically two clues laid by the FCA. One which said ICOs are risky. If you invest in them, you might lose your money, which is not massively helpful. And mostly they're not regulated, but some of them are regulated, which actually for a lawyer was great because there's lots of ambiguity and we can exploit that ambiguity as much as possible. And then secondly, they said, well, we don't think cryptocurrencies are regulated, but we think derivatives on cryptocurrencies should be treated as regulated instruments. So actually it's given us a certain amount to work with in terms of ICOs, and we are seeing a lot of interest in the ICO space. It's really, at the moment, it's like when the car was invented, the first cars looked like carriages without the horse. At the moment, we are working with the regulation that we have, and we have to work around that. And if we are sticking to utility or asset-based, generally the view is that we are okay, but you've got to be careful.
Yeah, in New Zealand, it would be actually quite difficult for your token to be a security under our framework. It depends on the bundle of rights, but you would still be subject to market conduct, no misleading, deceptive conduct or representations. Having said that, that's only issuing within New Zealand, so it's not hugely helpful to most people wanting to raise a lot of money because there's only 4 million New Zealanders. So I guess, and there's also a tax issue. So for New Zealand, it's very much projects sort of developing in New Zealand, but then going to low tax jurisdictions for utility tokens to maximize the value of the raise.
Daniel, Germany.
Well, although we have lots of extremely talented teams in Berlin, Germany is at least not yet a quite popular jurisdiction for issuance. Most of those teams look to other jurisdictions for their SPVs, but for various reasons, the most obvious one is probably that the German regulator BaFin is considering most tokens out there as a financial instrument under German banking laws, requiring you to obtain a license to broker those things or give investment advice, setting up a custody or a crypto exchange business, for instance. So this makes it quite difficult from a German standpoint, but on the upside, we have a very sophisticated and open-minded regulator, which is certainly trying to keep Main Street investors safe, but still trying to enable legit projects as well at the same time.
Now the US.
The US. So in the US, as you may know, our the chairman of our Securities Exchange Commission, Jay Clayton, has said in the media many times that he believes nearly every token sale that he's seen has been a sale of securities. This is a bit different from the guidance that we got in after the Dow, which said the Howey test applies, which is a facts and circumstances test that talks about an investment of money in a common enterprise with a reasonable expectation of profit based solely or primarily on managerial or entrepreneurial efforts of others. That made it sound like, okay, we're going to do these tests, we're going to figure it out, we're going to analyze. Then came a cease and desist order called Munchie, which really focused, among other things, on the manner of sale. It was saying, listen, if you're selling these things like you're selling an investment, and they pointed to a lot of different factors that I won't go into here, but that actually, even if your token did have functionality at the moment of sale or did have a utility that was non-incidental, you still could be selling a security. So that kind of closed the window for a while, for a long time, in crypto time, for non-security tokens, for large law firms really to be representing them, at least some large law firms. What's interesting is I really never believed that projects would start avoiding the US in many cases just to avoid the regulatory uncertainty. I very egotistically and self-centeredly thought, of course that's not going to happen, but I see it happening every day. Now, two really interesting things that I think have happened recently. One, you may have heard of, the state of Wyoming took its own view. It passed House Bill 70 along with 4 other blockchain-based bills, and actually they based that off of FINMA guidance, right, about what the categories of tokens. And so it's really interesting to see a state taking the position that it's a new form of property and that it is something that is the purview of the state and not the federal government. So we'll see how that goes, but it's certainly, in terms of educating others, it's huge. And actually, I believe, my understanding is that the folks in Wyoming were waiting for a call from the SEC saying, don't pass it, but that call never came, so it's interesting. One final thing, then I'll be quiet, is Director Hinman last week, yes, which was huge. So a director of corporate finance in the SEC talked about how a token that might initially be sold as a security might nonetheless, if there was sufficient decentralization, become not a security. So that was a huge development in our market.
Thank you, Josh. Now let's at the end just address one of the issues as well, which is the money laundering concerns. On one hand, we have a new technology allowing us to track all the transactions. Which you would think that for a compliance officer, this would be the most beautiful thing to have. All the transactions available, which a bank actually doesn't have. The bank only has the transaction within the institute, not the whole chain. Now, on one hand, we have the AML concerns. We have these transactions. On the other side, we have data protection laws. It's a little bit a conflict of interest here. Ursula, you're a specialist. Very short.
Yes, thank you. And I'm happy you mentioned the other topics. As Matthias Michel this morning said, we have many other issues, not only currency, but also business models in blockchain. And actually, we have a big research project on our university, and we struggle with the data protection issues, which, as you know, now in Europe, it's a big issue as well in Switzerland, and it's not impossible in the world of blockchain, but in the some types of business models in the open blockchain are probably are impossible. You have to choose how to deal with this, and this is a conflict of interest with control, with traceability in the world of anti-money laundering jurisdiction.
Thank you, Arch. Now, in the last minute has now started, and the director is already nervous, but now I would like to show you the last slide, which I'm so happy to always present. And Christine Lagarde, actually, I'm an absolute fan of her. She actually phrased it really nicely. Policymakers should keep an open mind and work towards an even-handed regulatory framework that minimizes risks while allowing the creative process to bear fruit. And I think this is the right approach which we have to go, in addition with finding the right way on defining what's really happening and making a really accurate and a very thorough analysis, and not too early think, okay, it is this or that. I think she's heading in the right direction. Thank you very much, panel, for your input. I hope that we could actually open a little bit your minds as well. Thank you very much for all of you.